No freedom, no hope, 24 hours in a maximum security prison. Subscribe for more real crime stories. Like, share, and join the discussion below. The scream started just after sunrise. Correctional officers sprinted down the narrow cell block of California State Prison, Corcoran, a place already infamous for brutality behind bars. When they reached cell 42, they froze. Inside, two inmates lay on the concrete floor, one motionless, the other drenched in blood, clutching a sharpened piece of metal made from a cafeteria tray. The attacker was Juan Corona, a man once convicted of one of the deadliest killing sprees in U.S. history. The victim was his own cellmate, another convicted murderer. The silence after the attack was heavy. Guards shouted commands, but the cell didn't move. Corona looked up, expression blank, and whispered. He wouldn't stop talking. The officers dragged him out, shackled and shaking, while medics rushed in. Within minutes, the lifeless man was pronounced dead, a homicide inside one of America's highest security facilities. It was supposed to be just another day of lockdown. But by noon, investigators realized this wasn't just an inmate fight. It was a grim echo of the crimes that made Juan Corona a name whispered in fear across California decades earlier, and proof that inside these walls, freedom wasn't the only thing lost. Hope was gone too. But who exactly was this quiet, elderly killer who had once buried dozens of men in the California soil, and how had the system allowed him to kill again, even behind bars? Decades earlier, in 1971, a farm worker in Yuba City, California, made a horrifying discovery. While plowing an orchard, his blade struck something that wasn't rock. It was bone. Human bone. Police were called immediately, and what they uncovered in the following days would haunt California history. As officers dug through the orchards, one shallow grave led to another. 25 in total. Each held the body of a male migrant worker, most of them undocumented, all of them stabbed or hacked to death. The bodies had been buried in neat rows, just a few feet apart, as if someone had made death part of their daily routine. The suspect was a local labor contractor named Juan Corona, a man known in the area for hiring and managing field workers. When investigators searched his home and car, they found something chilling, a notebook filled with names that matched several of the men buried in the orchard. The press called it the Machete Murders. The state called it one of the most gruesome killing sprees in American history. But even as evidence mounted, Corona remained eerily calm, insisting on his innocence, claiming he was being framed. His trial became one of the longest and most expensive in California at the time. Still, one question lingered for decades. If a man who killed 25 people couldn't be rehabilitated, why was he ever placed in a cell with another human being? When the Corcoran murder hit the news in 2019, survivors of the 1970s tragedy felt the wound reopen. A killer who had once been sentenced to die behind bars had, in the end, brought death there too. And yet, the full truth of how that final killing happened and how the system allowed it was only beginning to surface. When news broke that Juan Corona had struck again, this time inside the walls of Corcoran State Prison, the public reaction was disbelief. How could an 85-year-old man, frail and aging, still be capable of such violence? But for those who knew the story of his past, the act made an eerie kind of sense. Violence had followed him like a shadow since the very beginning. Corona's descent into darkness began long before the orchards turned into graveyards. Born in Mexico in 1934, he crossed into California during the 1950s, joining thousands of migrant workers chasing farm jobs. He was quiet, polite, and hardworking until something inside him broke. In 1956, after a violent mental breakdown, he was committed to a state hospital and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Doctors warned that he was dangerous. Yet a year later, he was released back into society. By the late 1960s, Corona had established himself as a reliable labor contractor in Yuba City. He was trusted by farmers to hire and manage field workers, most of them poor, transient men with no families nearby. To the outside world, he seemed disciplined, even strict. But to the men who worked under him, Corona could be unpredictable, sometimes generous, other times cruel and distant. Then, in the spring of 1971, those same men started disappearing. No one noticed at first. These were drifters, after all, men who came and went without warning. It wasn't until the orchard owner's plow struck the first shallow grave that people began to ask questions. And once they did, the horror unfolded faster than anyone could comprehend. Each day brought new discoveries: bodies stacked beneath the soil, machete wounds carved deep, and shallow pits dug so precisely they looked almost methodical. Investigators found wallets, shoes, and work tools mixed in the dirt. In Corona's truck, they found receipts for the same orchards where the graves were discovered. But it was that small spiral notebook, the so-called death ledger, that sealed his fate. Inside were 34 names, each belonging to a missing worker. Some of those names had X marks next to them. When detectives confronted Corona, he refused to explain what the marks meant. The silence was more terrifying than any confession. In 1973, he was convicted of 25 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. At the time, it was the largest number of murder convictions in U.S. history. But even after decades behind bars, Corona never admitted guilt. He spent his days writing letters, reading scripture, and avoiding interviews. By 2019, he was old, frail, and mostly silent. The prison saw him as low risk. Guards thought he just wanted peace in his final years. But then came that morning, when they found another man dead beside him, the concrete streaked with blood. Prison officials tried to explain it as a fight between cellmates, but investigators knew better. This wasn't a brawl. It was a pattern repeating itself, one last echo of a killer's dark compulsion. And as detectives started digging into that final incident, they uncovered something the public was never meant to see: records showing that Corona had been moved into a shared cell despite warnings from mental health staff. Someone inside the system had made a fatal mistake. But who approved it? And how many warnings were ignored before death came knocking one last time? When the California Department of Corrections launched its internal review, they expected a simple answer: an administrative error, a paperwork oversight, maybe a rushed housing assignment. What they found instead was a web of negligence that stretched across years of ignored warnings. Juan Corona, despite his frail body, had been flagged multiple times by prison psychiatrists as unfit for double housing. His long history of paranoia, aggression, and hallucinations made him a risk to any cellmate. Yet he was still assigned to share a cell. Why? Because the system was overcrowded. Corcoran, one of the toughest maximum security prisons in America, had seen decades of violence. Inmates killed each other in the yards, in the showers, in the cells where cameras didn't reach. Officers were overworked and outnumbered. Files got buried, recommendations got lost, and the priority became efficiency, not safety. Corona's new cellmate, a convicted murderer himself, had complained days earlier that Corona kept whispering prayers at night, muttering about men in the walls and voices in the orchard. No one listened. The next morning, the man was dead. Inside the prison, word spread fast. Inmates called it the orchard curse. Some said Corona's demons had never left him. Guards whispered that the old man had waited decades for one more chance to kill. But the truth was simpler and sadder. It wasn't evil that let the killing happen again. It was neglect. When investigators visited Corona after the attack, they found him sitting on his bunk, staring at the wall. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain it. He just said he wouldn't stop talking. There was no rage in his voice, no guilt, just emptiness. To him, violence wasn't an event. It was routine. Reporters outside the prison demanded answers. Victims' families from the 1971 killings spoke out, saying the system had failed again. He took 25 lives and got to take another one, said one sister of a farm worker victim. Even after all these years, nobody learned. Within months, the Department of Corrections quietly changed its housing policy for elderly violent offenders. But for the men locked inside Corcoran, the message was clear: safety didn't exist here. Whether you were 25 or 85, time didn't wash away danger. In 2021, just 2 years after the prison murder, Juan Corona died in the medical ward, alone and unrepentant. The official cause, natural causes. He never spoke about the final killing again. No apology, no confession, just silence. For the families of his victims, that silence was its own kind of torment. For the system, it was a reminder of how quickly control can collapse behind concrete walls. Inside Corcoran, guards still talk about that day. The sound of the alarms. The sight of the old man sitting still beside a lifeless body. The quiet that followed. Because in those 24 hours, one truth became painfully clear. In a place built to strip men of freedom, it had also stripped them of hope. Even death, inside those walls, felt like routine.